Welcome everyone, this is Dr. Mercola, and today we're here to discuss a topic that is becoming progressively more recognized as a really important tool in optimizing our health, and that is the clinical use of sulfur as an adjunct in our diet. And certainly diet is one of the primary main tools that I advocate for optimizing your ability to reduce your risk for chronic degenerative diseases. But the practical question becomes, how do you obtain that sulfur? So in an effort to provide another resource, joining me today is Rod Benjamin, who's the Director of Technical Development for Bergstrom Nutrition. And they are based out of Vancouver, Washington, and they have the world's only grass-designed, proprietary, and patented MSM. So we're really excited that Rod could join us today and provide us with some insights into this really important topic. And he's been doing this for quite some time, as you'll find out, and has acquired a wealth of information that he's excited to share with us. So thank you for joining us today.
And thank you, Dr. Mercola.
So I think the central crux that we'd like to discuss is the use of sulfur. But before we get into MSM, which you're heavily involved with, I'd like to sort of help people understand how we got to this point. So maybe because the MSM is a form of DMSO. It's a similar type of product. So, and I first became aware of DMSO decades ago. I mean, 60 Minutes has been on for at least 40 years, and I think there was a 60 Minutes with Stan Jacobs in the 70s.
Correct.
And they used DMSO at that time. It was really controversial, certainly in the veterinary medicine, and they were using it very successfully for thoroughbred racehorses. And they were applying it topically, and they were getting phenomenal results, so phenomenal and fantastic that 60 Minutes actually filmed a segment on it. So that was how I first became aware. It actually far predated my entrance into medical school. So I'm wondering if you could help expand on that and sort of set the stage so that we can have the discussion on MSM.
Dr. Jacob actually was very interested in DMSO. You know, it had been used as a therapeutic compound in racehorses, allowed them to go back onto the track faster. It supported their soft tissue, helped with muscle soreness, soft tissue injury, actually helped with pulmonary or lung function.
So and when did he figure that out? He found that in the late 60s or so?
Yeah, late 60s and into the early 70s.
And are there any specific racehorses or that he actually used it with that got results, or specific, or was it just generally known within the industry? And how did 60 Minutes find out about it?
And that was actually, you know, it was used in the racehorses, but you have to remember that Stan Jacob is a medical doctor. Right. So where his interest in it and knowing about how it had been used in veterinary medicine for supporting these racehorses and whatnot. But another interesting thing about DMSO is the temperature that it freezes at, okay, is about 65 degrees Fahrenheit. And so Dr. Jacob had been very deeply involved in looking at cryogenic preservation of tissues and organs for transplant. And through his knowledge of here's a substance that seems to be very low toxicity because it's been being used in racehorses and whatnot, but it also has these other properties that would allow it to be frozen. Now, if you were to freeze organs and things in water, you actually get rupture of the cell membranes, and that damages the cells and the tissue and makes it so it's not able to be transplanted. So he started looking at DMSO from that, for that reason, and along that line found that he was able to freeze organs and thaw them back out with very minimal damage. But along that line, they had to really evaluate toxicity of this and what are the potential side effects. If you were to put an organ that has been preserved in DMSO into someone, they're going to have a fairly large amount of DMSO in the body, and what are going to be the effects on that. So there really a lot of the pharmaceutical companies that were in business at the time, top 5, actually started doing extensive research on, like I said, it started out as toxicity studies, but then they started finding that there were some very interesting therapeutic advantages to using
Benefits.
DMS. Yeah, definitely some benefits being seen. And that basically led to tons of research. They say DMSO could be one of the most researched drugs out there today.
Is it classified technically as a drug, though?
DMSO is classified as a drug within the United States.
Do people need a prescription to get it? Because, or the people are
Well,
using, because many people use it, but they just buy the veterinary product and then apply it topically, or how does that work?
They do it regulatory-wise. Actually, DMSO for human usage must be obtained by prescription.
Okay.
Now, DMSO is available. You can buy it at a lot of veterinary supply stores and things like that. But it's not to be used for human use, okay? And it's a great industrial solvent is how they kind of sell that. So it's a little under the radar there.
Well, getting back to the veterinary uses, what are the benefits that are noticed in animals? I mean, is it actually reducing swelling, inflammation?
It's reducing inflammation.
Arthritic types of conditions?
Yeah, exactly. Primarily anti-inflammatory, reduction of swelling. It's actually used for a lot of things. It improves or seems to improve cell wall permeability. So it's also can be used to help deliver other active ingredients.
And actually, I use that clinically myself because, as you mentioned earlier, alluded to, it's a phenomenal solvent, and that it does have the other ability to penetrate your skin and transfer right directly into the bloodstream. So it can also take with it anything that's dissolved in it. So many people may know that vitamin B12 is the largest vitamin out there, and as a result of that, you don't absorb it very well. You can swallow it, but unless you have a really functioning, highly functioning intrinsic factor system, you develop something called pernicious anemia, but essentially you need that intrinsic factor to combine with vitamin B12 to be absorbed. Without it, it just passes right through you. So and many people as they age lose the ability to make intrinsic factor, which is why they develop this anemia called pernicious anemia. So as a result, many people inject B12, or you can use sublingual sprays, but sublingual sprays are a relatively new innovation, and a while back what we had done was dissolve the B12 in the DMSO. You would apply the DMSO on your skin. It would take it right through, right into your bloodstream, essentially getting the benefits of an injectable B12 without the hassle of the needles. So just another potent demonstration of one of the benefits of DMSO is that it can be used as a carrier vehicle to introduce substances into the bloodstream.
Correct, and that is, like I say, but as far as the layperson using it for that purpose, you have to be very careful because it does take things directly into the bloodstream.
Well, it could also take the dirt or any toxins you might have in your skin. It would take them right through. So you have to make sure it's on clean skin, or even not. It would take the soaps used to clean your skin right through to your bloodstream. Exactly,
and that's why it's best to use it in that manner, to do it under a doctor's supervision and whatnot. But
it's a really interesting substance.
It is, and Dr. Stanley Jacob, as you mentioned, one of the interesting things, and this is something in talking about the 60-minute interview that he said, he has one main regret on that interview was he talked about DMSO has a wide variety of uses, and he said it wasn't well received per se by the pharmaceutical or drug industry at the time because they had a very much of a singular idea or focus for therapeutic agents. In other words, you have one thing that's wrong with you, you take one drug for this one thing, or maybe one drug that would or a medicinal entity to address 5 different things. But he said DMSO and MSM together with that, in his opinion, is much more of a therapeutic principle. So it's similar to exercise or proper nutrition. It's more of instead of that singular focus that is so prevalent within the drug or pharma per se, it's much more of a therapeutic principle, which is overall body wellness. Which strongly suggests that it's providing some missing link,
And maybe you can expand on that, because it appears that MSM might be related to sulfur. And sulfur is just becoming more widely appreciated, that we have a decrease of that in most people's diet. And it serves such an important, critical role, especially in detoxification, but also in inflammatory conditions. And for detoxification, sulfur is part of probably one of the most important antioxidants that our body produces, which is glutathione. And without sulfur, glutathione just can't work. So maybe you can touch on some of the components of how it works, or at least Dr. Jacobs, or your impression as to, DMSO and then / MSM, and talk about the connections between the MSO and MSM.
Well, I'm going to go back to the part of DMSO that I'd mentioned, where they found that a lot, or approximately on average, is 15% of any DMSO dosage that you take converts to MSM in the body. So this huge proliferation of research that was done on DMSO and those therapeutic properties, it begs the question, how many of those therapeutic properties are due to the DMSO, or are they due to its metabolite, MSM, once it's been converted in vivo or within the body? Okay. Now, in that, sulfur, as you mentioned, very important. It's in over 150 different compounds within the body. It's virtually, sulfur is a component of every cell within the body. So it's extremely important. Now, as far as MSM's role within the body, it's very complicated, and I will say that it's not 100% understood. I've been working with this compound for 16 years to try and answer that question. We understand part of the mechanism of action, but not all of it. We have pharmacokinetic studies, pharmacodynamic studies that actually look at, basically that's to determine, once you take MSM, these were basically oral studies, once you take them, what happens to it? Where does it go? How long does it take to get into the body? How long does it remain in the body, and where is it dispersed?
But is there research supporting that it actually is a valuable source of sulfur? Any tag studies with radioisotopes?
And that's where I was leading to with that, is that there's been radio labeled, so where you take a radioactive tag and put on the sulfur itself and put it into the body. And actually in 1986, Richmond did a study on that, and it showed that it was taken up into serum proteins, so that sulfur was actually incorporated into serum proteins. Okay, we also have done, like the pharmacokinetic study, which showed that radio-labeled sulfur was taken up into hair, skin, and nails. Keratin is a very high sulfur containing compound, which is a building block for your nails and your hair. But it also showed up in almost all tissues, the spleen, the liver, went all over. But the interesting thing in that was we were looking at the radio label on the sulfur. I believe that it does give up the sulfur. We have seen that, for instance, a decrease. There's been 4 human clinical trials now that have shown a decrease in homocysteine levels when supplemented with MSM versus a placebo. Okay, but the interesting thing is we did, and this is why I say it's complicated. We did a study where we said, okay, let's give it to healthy human volunteers. We did actually 3 different dosage, 1 gram, 2 gram, 3 gram, and we measured urinary sulfur output by measuring sulfate, okay, thinking that sulfate will be a waste sulfur product that would show up excreted in the urine. And we did the different doses to see if it was in a dose-dependent manner, and that would be able to correlate back and say, yeah, so MSM's giving up its sulfur and it's coming out, more. And we found that they were indeed dose-related, but the interesting thing was it was inversely related. So the more MSM you took, the less sulfate that was excreted in your urine. So what that says is it's much more complicated than just a strict sulfur donor, okay? It is affecting the compartmentalization of sulfur and sulfur metabolism within the body.
Mm-hmm.
So that suggests that MSM actually is allowing better metabolism, better incorporation of the sulfur throughout the body. So not just as a simple sulfur donor, but...
Well, let's just clear up some of the transition from MSM
Sure.
and DMSO, because DMSO was, it predated MSM. I mean,
Correct.
that was the original application of this technology. Had some other benefits, as you mentioned. It was useful, seemed to be in cryopreservation of tissues, which MSM doesn't do.
No.
But it appears, and maybe to this day, strongly suggests that the bulk of the therapeutic clinical benefits was related to the fact that about 15% of it was converted to MSM as a downstream metabolite. And the downside of using DMSO, even though it's not legal to use it for humans, but many people wind up, because there's an easy workaround, you can buy it in a veterinary supply store, is that you're going to have quite a significant odor, and it's really offensive to many people that you're around. It's not too dissimilar than taking very large amounts of gum, but probably even worse than that.
Right.
So it seems that the contemporary version of DMSO, at least in humans, is MSM, which is legal in humans. And for those who like to know the chemical name, MSM is an acronym. It's short for methyl sulfonyl methane.
Correct.
So it's obviously much easier to say MSM, so that's why we say MSM. But in case anyone's wondering what that stands for, which is not to be confused with MMS, which is another product, but MSM, the nutritional product. So why don't you tell us how you first became interested in it, because you've been doing this for about 16 years, so just before the turn of the century, and was that in any way related to a connection with Dr. Jacobs?
Well, it basically, I was always interested in DMSO because I was born and raised in Pacific Northwest, close to Portland, Oregon.
Okay.
And then I can remember actually, as a kid, newspaper articles about DMSO. And I can remember thinking, and you know, you have to remember that as a child you have limited actual understanding of what's going on, but
Sure.
It was like, I read about DMSO and it was like, wow, there's this new super drug that's been discovered, and wow, it's like the cure-all of everything. And actually, for a while, it was kind of promoted on that, and there was some issues with FDA about that.
Because this is prior to the FDA reclassification.
Yes, and this was when it first came out, and it was in the local papers, of course, growing up, and I was like, wow, that'd be so neat to be able to discover something that is so beneficial and so helpful to overall health and wellness of people. And it's funny, I wanted to be a scientist from the time I was a very small kid, and I was just thinking, wow, it'd be so neat, because you really kind of think, well, you know, there's not all that many new things to be discovered out there as you know we continue to progress. And I remember thinking about that. Well, it turns out that the founder of the company that I work for, he worked with Dr. Jacob and was familiar with that. And so when he formed this company, I had went on and became a chemist, and he actually contacted me and asked me if I'd be interested in coming to work for him. So it was kind of interesting. Of course, here's something DMSO, it's related to DMSO, something that I had been...
Or MSM is related to DMSO.
Right. And you know, his company manufactured the MSM. So he asked if I'd be interested in coming to work for him. And I have to say, where I had second guess on that was I was working for a company that made hundreds of different compounds, and here I was going to work for a company that made one and only one thing. But I did it, and...
So you had a chance to participate in one of your childhood dreams.
Exactly. And it has not disappointed me, because the more we learn about it, the more amazed I am.
Well, why don't you highlight some of the more recent clinical studies that tend to support some of your initial excitement and enthusiasm, and have probably even increased it further?
Yeah, well, as you know, it was interested a little bit, if I can talk just a little bit about how MSM originally, I went to work there like DMSO, it was like, wow, it's good for all of these different things. We kind of knew that going on. There was a lot of anecdotal evidence, so in other words, people had tried it. Dr. Jacob had used it for treating patients for all kinds of different maladies.
DMSO.
DMSO and MSM, because what
okay.
he did, because of the disagreeable odor, he started diluting DMSO with MSM fairly early on, because that would minimize that disagreeable odor and
how
taste.
How would he apply? Topically still?
Actually, it was being used intravenously, topically. It depended on the specific condition that he was trying to treat. And he would play around with a DMSO, MSM ratio, depending on, I mean, if someone was extremely sensitive to that taste and odor of the DMSO, he would scale back the DMSO, increase the MSM, and treat them that way to minimize that disagreeable
So he realized early on that MSM may be one of the important components here.
Yes, yes, very early on. And he used it a lot for that. But we focused very early on saying, you know, and this was actually part of Dr. Jacob's advice to us, is if you go out there and say that this is good for all of these things, you know, people are going to look at you like you're a snake oil salesman. And that is kind of the mentality. So, but as we continued to research it, we found tying into the mechanism and what it actually does, of how it could indeed be useful in a number of different areas. You start looking at some of the latest research that's been within the last 2 years. There's been at least 4 human clinical trials on MSM and its ability to help with exercise recovery. Okay, so basically that ties back to oxidative.
So would that be related to the muscle injuries like DOMS, delayed onset muscle stiffness or soreness?
Yes, and actually in one of the studies they were looking at the VAS pain score, so that's muscle soreness due to exercise, and there was a significant reduction in the MSM treated group versus placebo, so that's directly tied to the muscle soreness. But it, more than that, it looked also at, there was a study that looked at creatine kinase, CK, and lactate dehydrogenase. Now these are enzymes that are produced by muscles from muscular damage, like CK. That's an enzyme that they look at if you have a heart attack. So large muscle injury. This was actually done in healthy human volunteers running a 10-kilometer race, and then they measured the CK afterwards. So you're talking large muscles damaged from because they weren't properly conditioned. They're going out, they're running this marathon, and then they measured the creatine CK, this creatine kinase, post-run, and found that MSM significantly reduced the CK. So it protected the muscles from that. Now, it appears now, and there's been a number of different studies looking at this, that it protects from oxidative damage. Okay, and so you're looking at, and of course now we start getting into the different markers. I don't want to go there because that gets pretty technical, you know, MDA, protein carbonyls, and things like that. But they measured these markers of oxidative damage, cellular damage done by oxidative stress. And MSM does seem to protect that. Now you mentioned glutathione. They also have both in animal model and human models. This research has shown that an increase in glutathione, but even on top of that, glutathione has 2 different states within the body. There's reduced glutathione and oxidized glutathione. And the ratio of those two talks about the overall oxidative status, or the ability of the blood plasma to address oxidative stress. And MSM did improve that overall ratio. In other words, you have much more reduced glutathione. It's able to deal with these free radicals and whatnot. So if you start looking at that, you have oxidative stress and controlling that. Well, oxidative stress can lead to inflammation. Inflammation leads to more oxidative stress. So it's a cyclical type of thing, and even in the Wall Street Journal, New York Times fairly recently has put out articles talking about low-level chronic inflammation and its potential role in chronic disease, like for instance diabetes, cancer, vascular disease, and things of that nature. So, you know, that's I think kind of the key of how MSM really, and I mean, this is also, DMSO does the same thing, by controlling that oxidative stress or protecting from the oxidative damage, it can have this therapeutic.
Now, glutathione is an endogenous antioxidant. That means our body makes it. And MSM by itself is not an antioxidant. It seems to work by improving the body's ability to make its own antioxidants.
Correct.
Now, there are exogenous antioxidants that are found in nature that are really potent also. And the one that comes to mind is most obviously is astaxanthin, which seems to be the premier new antioxidant of the 21st century. And I'm wondering if you're aware if there's any studies that compare the antioxidant benefit from MSM versus something like astaxanthin. May not be any because it's relatively new.
No, and there is no per se side-by-side studies that do that. You know, one of the, you have your superfruits, antioxidant, those kind of studies.
Astaxanthin really isn't a fruit, it's an extract from marine algae.
Oh, okay.
Hematococcus. And it's produced as when this algae is stressed, and it basically allows it to survive and go through very harsh conditions, and it's extracted out and seems to have enormous benefit throughout the animal kingdom. Especially somewhat similar to the benefit of MSM in delayed onset muscle soreness and actually allowing athletes to pursue quite incredible feats, salmon being the example, which have some of the highest concentrations of astaxanthin, and perform one of the most significant athletic feats in the animal kingdom, which is spawning and swimming upstream. Right. It's a ridiculous athletic feat, but they're able to do it, and many of the scientists believe it's a large part related to the astaxanthin, because otherwise the oxidative stress and damage to the muscle tissue, they really couldn't survive without some type of adjunctive support.
Yeah, and to my knowledge, there's been no side-by-side comparative studies of those. But you will see similar markers between some of them used in some of the MSM studies as you do in the astaxanthin.
Yeah, and my guess and take is that they work synergistically. They perform similar functions, but definitely indeed distinct different functions, and they both benefit each other, because if you're able to, ultimately the way antioxidants work is to transfer electrons around. Right. And astaxanthin works a little bit differently. It absorbs it without an electron, but it essentially spares electrons, so it keeps them in the body rather than consuming them, trying to eradicate these free radicals, which is one of the primary mechanisms. If you don't have antioxidants, you get free radical damage, which really significantly impairs the function of your DNA and your proteins, and if the DNA makes the proteins, but ultimately it's mediated through proteins, and if your proteins aren't working well, you don't work too well.
Right. And I think, with the MSM actually works more on an intercellular level, and so it's mitigating the expression of reactive oxygen and nitrogen species. Once they're made, MSM will not neutralize them per se. So I think there's a little bit of a different mechanism, and like you say, I really believe the two would work synergistically together. So
that's terrific. So I think that the challenge, ultimately, I think it sounds like you would agree that one of the primary mechanisms, although it's still not well elucidated at this time, is that it may be serving as a source of sulfur, so our body can use this sulfur to create antioxidants like glutathione, but also for other structural proteins where sulfur is an important component.
Yes.
Because I don't recall specifically, but I believe there are some non-essential amino acids that require sulfur, and if you don't have the sulfur as a building block, you can't make them.
Right, and MSM is 34% sulfur by weight, so
it wouldn't be unreasonable to assume that's one of the main ways that it's effective.
Correct.
So ideally, we'd like to get our sulfur from food if we can, and that's a bit of a challenge because there's been a transition away from many traditional foods that really have been the big source of sulfur, like collagen or keratin, that we just don't eat too much nowadays. You can if you do bone broths and you cook down these bones, which has the connective tissue where the sulfur lies and dissolves into the water, and then you can drink the bone broth or the soup. But most of us don't do that. So then this MSM seems to be a useful adjunct to rebuild those sulfur stores. So I'm wondering, are there any food sources of MSM, or is it just really available as a supplement?
Well, MSM is in almost all raw foods. Okay, so it's in leafy green vegetables. Interestingly enough, there's MSM in beer, coffee, and actually it's been identified as one of the main flavoring constituent in port wines. So it is
One
in
of
a
my
number.
favorites.
So it is naturally occurring in a number of foods. But a very interesting thing is that in raw milk is actually the highest natural occurring content of MSM.
Interesting.
And there's a study
so
that
when
was...
it's pasteurized, that MSM somehow disappears?
Yes, and there's actually a study that I came across, and it wasn't specifically looking at MSM, it was actually looking at all volatile sulfur compounds, because there is a recognized by consumers difference between the taste and odor of raw milk versus pasteurized milk. And so they were trying to determine what is the cause of that different
MSM
taste
can be
and odor.
volatilized as a gas?
Yes, and the interesting thing is MSM is an extremely stable molecule from a chemistry standpoint, and I don't mean to bore you with but it's a sulfur with 2 double bonded oxygens and 2 methyl groups. So for lack of a better way of saying it, it's a very happy little molecule. It's very stable. It's stable to extremes of pH, temperature, and things like that. And a lot of people say, oh, well, you destroy MSM when you cook things. You're not destroying it. What happens is it volatilizes very easy, just driven off. And so in ultra high temperature pasteurization, because that's what they looked at, was UHT, and they looked at the different skim milk, 1%, 2%, and 3.8, so homogenized milk, and it actually cut the MSM content approximately by 50% by pasteurizing it. And essentially, and that's a flash heating process, and in that short period of time that they do that, it drove off half of the MSM.
Does something similar happen with vegetables when we cook them?
Yes, because MSM is also very water soluble. So think about when you're cooking vegetables, generally steam is coming off, and the MSM is carried off in the steam. Plus, MSM has a unique property, it sublimates very easily. Sublimation is a technical word that basically means it can go from a solid to a gaseous form without going into that intermediate liquid phase. You think of ice, water, steam. Well, that's like saying that you could go directly from ice to steam without going to the water phase in between. Well, that's kind of what happens with MSM, and that's why it's easily removed in processing.
So somewhat of a supportive argument for consuming raw foods, or at least foods minimally processed.
Yes.
So it wouldn't be unreasonable to consider that if someone had a highly processed diet, or was for some reason consuming foods that really were devoid of this nutrient because they weren't grown properly, then it might make sense to consider adding something that was in the foods to begin with, which is MSM, in relatively high levels, gram quantities, because a lot of supplements we just take in microgram quantities, like selenium would become, which is actually one of the components of glutathione, which we believe MSM helps create. But you would never take a gram of selenium unless you had a death wish.
Right.
But these, you'd have to take a few grams of some MSM, because it's really more of a food than it is a micronutrient.
Yeah, correct. And toxicity studies have shown that MSM is extremely safe, and it can be taken at very, very high doses. So, you can take, even if you have a raw or a very rich diet full of a lot of raw vegetables and things like that, where you're going to get a fairly large amount of MSM, you can still supplement and not hit that toxicity level. MSM is extremely safe.
If your diet's not optimized, it would probably make sense, considering all the well-known and recently appreciated benefits of sulfur, its importance in the human diet, which isn't really widely known. Even traditional clinical science or nutrition does not really focus on that at all. In fact, I don't even know that it's certainly not required to be on a label content with the sulfur content as a food, but it's just not appreciated how important this is. But there's an emerging consensus that we should probably put some focus on this, because it was just assumed we weren't deficient in it, but that may not be the case. So so there's this whole justification that people could use to consume it as additional source if they weren't getting an optimized diet. But then there's also another segment of the population who may have some clinical condition where additional sources of sulfur like MSM may be therapeutic. So could you provide us with a list of those conditions where if people had these, they might consider using some supplemental sulfur sources?
Well, a lot of chronic inflammatory conditions, fibromyalgia, you know, even chronic fatigue syndrome. People that are suffering from aches and pains. I mean, a lot of those kind of conditions I believe would potentially benefit from MSM. But also if you don't suffer from those kind of conditions, I mean, I think we all have been subject to, you know, you kind of sit around, or most people are less active through the winter. So in springtime comes around, you got to go out, you got to start, you know, putting in a garden and doing that kind of work. You end up with sore muscles and things like that. So MSM can definitely, and even the clinical evidence shows that MSM helps prevent that the sore muscles, achy joints, but it also seems to be preventative. Remember, I was talking about the protection from oxidative damage. Now, oxidative damage can lead to premature aging, and again, to low-level chronic inflammation, which can lead to those diseases. So you say, what conditions is it good for? I really think everybody can benefit from it, because it seems to, or the data suggests a potential preventative effect, so that you don't end up with these kind of conditions.
Yeah, I think it's probably wise overall. I'm not sure that it's the same mechanism for some of the diseases you mentioned, like fibromyalgia or chronic fatigue, which probably don't have necessarily an inflammatory component, more of an autoimmune issue going on that needs to be, you know, re-regulated. But certainly inflammatory conditions like most arthritis, possibly even autoimmune diseases. But through a different mechanism, by optimizing different pathways where sulfur was deficient. And then certainly people who are suffering from toxicity, because glutathione is probably, as you mentioned, is really requires sulfur. There's a sulfur deficiency, your body's not going to make enough. Glutathione is absolutely essential for removing heavy metals and many of the toxins that we're exposed to. However, it's not just simply glutathione. And there's many other variables that need to be addressed in addition to that. So you just can't optimize magically your glutathione levels and start to get better. So it's really part of a whole comprehensive program. But as part of a comprehensive approach, it can be a very important tool.
Yeah, definitely.
So can you discuss some of the dosages that one might consider? And is there a need to start at a slow rate because of some type of buildup that needs to occur? Or can just one go into it and maybe we can review the dosaging?
Well, it does, you know, each individual is a little bit different. The efficacy or effective amounts or in the clinical studies do show from about 1.5 grams on up to about 6 grams for effective dose. But some people have had mild adverse events, which would be minor intestinal distress, and you know, some have had swelling of the ankles and maybe mild skin rash, which would be like a detoxifying effect. And that can usually be mitigated or minimized by cutting back on the initial dosage. So of course, in that case, you know, you might want to start out with 0.5 gram, so 500 milligrams for a couple weeks, and then, you know, slowly increase till you get up to the desired dose.
And how does MSM come packaged typically? 500 milligrams or 0.5 gram?
Generally, in tablet or capsule form, you see anywhere from 750 or 500 up to 1,000 milligrams per.
It's usually swallowed as a capsule, because I believe if one could take the MSM and dissolve it in water, it doesn't dissolve completely, but it does dissolve. But there's probably a significant taste issue there.
There can be. I know that you can take a teaspoon, which is roughly 3 grams, and put in an 8-ounce glass of water, and it has very small impact on the taste. And I do know people that have trouble swallowing, because MSM has been used quite a bit by an elderly population. A lot of them have trouble swallowing pills.
Sure.
So I have advised a lot of them to use powder in their favorite beverage. And generally, if you're using 8 ounces of liquid, you can get up to 3 grams to dissolve fairly easily.
And when did MSM first become popular? Was it in the mid-90s or so, or 80s?
It was initially recognized in about the mid-80s by the work of Robert Hirschler, but it really started moving into the human usage in the 90s, late 90s, about 98, 97, 98, and into 99.
Now, there are a number of different places or manufacturers that produce MSM, and you know, like anything, any supplement or any food, quality is a major issue. And because there's, in the production of a supplement specifically, there's a lot of opportunity for introduction of mistakes or errors or inferior quality raw materials that produce things. So I'm wondering if they can give us any cautions or concerns or guidelines that one could use to identify a company that was producing high quality MSM.
Well, there are different methods of purification of MSM, and
what is it purified from? What's the raw material that's being purified from?
Raw material that's made from DMSO.
Okay, so you take DMSO.
DMSO.
And where does the DMSO come from?
DMSO is manufactured from DMS, dimethyl sulfide. So you have those 3 compounds, which are dimethyl sulfur compounds that are kind of a family of compounds, all tied together, part of the Earth's natural sulfur cycle. Okay. And whatnot, and essentially when we make MSM, we're more or less doing it in the same manner that it's done in nature. DMS, dimethyl sulfide, is produced in the oceans by phytoplankton and algae. It's a very volatile compound, so it rises up into the atmosphere.
Is that also produced in volcanoes? Is that hydrogen sulfide?
That's hydrogen sulfide, generally. But the DMS goes up into the atmosphere where it comes in contact with the ozone and high energy ultraviolet light, and actually oxidizes the DMS to DMSO and DMSO2, which is MSM. That's synonymous. And then it comes back to the Earth as rain. So that's the Earth's natural sulfur cycle. And that's essentially the way it's made. Now, the key is the purification of that. And it's best if it's purified by distillation. Engineering handbooks on different ways of purification. There's 2 main ones, are crystallization and distillation. Distillation is by far superior.
There's some companies that use the former approach because
do
it's less
use
expensive.
crystallization, a lot less energy intensive. But one of the problems with that is you're essentially crystallizing it out of a parent solvent or liquid. And if there's any impurities, which could be salts of heavy metals, you could have aromatic hydrocarbons in that. It's actually the parent solvent, it's usually water. So it is dependent upon water quality. And anyway, when those crystals form, they form what they call occlusions, which are imperfections within the crystals of where these impurities could be entrapped, and you end up with a less pure MSM. So by distillation, you know, essentially it's like distilling water. You drive it off as in its gaseous phase, and then condense it back into its solid phase.
A lot purer product.
Oh yeah.
So what percentage of companies would use the crystallization, which has much potential for contamination, and an impure product versus the distillation?
Actually, there is probably about, I'd say 70, well, there's only one, well, there's 2 companies that actually use distillation. And
There's only 2 companies making MSM that produces it. Almost everyone else uses
crystallization as a method of purification, yes. Okay. And
so if someone was seeking to find a source of MSM, you need, and many of these are sort of private labeled or branded, but you have to go ultimately back to where they're buying the source from and then find out if in fact it was crystallized or distilled.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
And there's only 2 companies that do the distillation.
Yes, and you know, actually one that provides approximately about 80% of the domestic market, U.S. domestic market, and probably about 65 to 70% of the international market.
Okay.
They provide MSM.
So it's the big player. So you want
It's
to make
definitely
sure
the big player, and they're also a single-purpose facility. So the nice thing about that is there is absolutely no danger of cross-contamination of other products because all of the plumbing within that facility is dedicated strictly to MSM production.
Okay. Are there any other conditions that one should look for when you're, or criteria that one should look for when you're seeking to purchase MSM?
Just looking to make sure that you have, you know, efficacious dosage on it. Other than that, it basically making sure that it's a purified.
Purified from distillation. Okay.
Purified by
now,
distillation.
we had talked initially when we first started the discussion about Stanley Jacobs and him essentially being the father of this whole field.
Correct.
And developing the whole process and the science behind it, and really looked at as one of the major pioneers. But I believe he's only sort of endorsed or come to work with one company producing MSM. Is that correct?
That is correct, and he endorses the branded name of the ingredient is Opti MSM, kind of a play on optimism, I guess, and produced by Bergstrom Nutrition, and so he's on the staff as one of their medical advisor still. And yeah.
Is this Bergstrom Nutrition the one that does the distillation?
Correct.
And the one that is the major supplier of MSM in the world?
Yes.
Okay, so if you're going to be choosing to use this, what appears to be a very highly beneficial, very safe, non-toxic supplement, you want to get one that has this Opti MSM from Bergstrom Nutrition.
Correct.
And then stay away from any what's crystal. They may be okay, but you don't know. You're just like rolling the dice, and it doesn't make sense to use an inferior quality if you're going to make the commitment. And probably the price difference is minimal.
Yeah, it would be for the you know,
The
as far
final
as,
product.
Yeah,
It's
the
gonna
final
be pretty
product
similar.
of
It
the
might be
consumer.
Pennies, you know.
Exactly.
Yeah, so-
Pennies per dose at the most.
It's really exciting, as I said, and want to reinforce. Sulfur is the emerging stealth player in nutrition, and for a variety of mechanisms. It appears to be working through a detoxification, but also as an anti-inflammatory. And glutathione is just, I mean, it's just so widely appreciated that is so foundationally essential, that they have a good or a highly functioning glutathione system. And if you don't have enough sulfur in your diet, you're not going to be able to have that. So that's one mechanism, but then also just from general structural proteins. I mean, there's this, because of the progressively decreasing quality of the vast majority of the people in Western countries, their ability to consume sulfur, typically in the form of MSM, and their diet in the form of raw foods, is decreasing and has been decreasing for decades. So it would make sense that if you're suffering from this decrease in normal sulfur that you would get from your diet, that supplementing with something that's relatively safe and relatively inexpensive would seem to make a lot of sense. So it's one that should be considered. It's not one we've recommended before, but that's because we're like many others, kind of somewhat late to the game in really fully appreciating the benefits and the importance of sulfur. And we're still light years ahead of the traditional clinical nutritionists who are basically clueless about the awareness, at least, of the sulfur deficiency, which I think will change. Very similar to vitamin D deficiency, which was essentially absolutely just not appreciated until this century, largely because of the technology we had to measure it clinically, because it was just a research tool before, and it wasn't really known how widely deficient people were in vitamin D. But that's a really good example. I mean, now everyone knows we need vitamin D, and it's just widely appreciated. But not too long ago, 15 years ago for sure, maybe 12 years, virtually everyone was clueless about this. So I think we're going to see a similar transition with sulfur. I don't know if it's going to be as rapid or as widely adopted, but I really think we're going to move in that direction. So I'm excited. I think it has enormous potential and something that should be seriously considered if inflammatory conditions or detoxification especially is a challenge, or if you have some mystery illness that you seem to be doing everything right but not getting better. It's certainly virtually side effect free and certainly inexpensive enough to give it a try.
Yeah, I definitely agree.
Well, thank you for joining us. Appreciate your time, effort, and energy, and all your efforts to help bring this product to the market.
Well, thank you for having me. I appreciate the opportunity to come and talk about MSM.
Okay. All right.